Hello and welcome to another episode of Virtual Coffee with Ashish. And today I have an interesting topic to cover, especially for those of you who have been managing a team or trying to see how you can increase the effectiveness of your team. And I've got a really interesting guest to come and talk about this. But before we go into the show, a little bit about what we are and what we do. So, Virtual Coffee for Ashish is a weekly cybersecurity show, and we are, I guess, we're like a couple of months old, I think. But we're streaming live on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitch, and that was three fingers. If you guys can figure it out, we're on multi-streaming or multi-streaming, as they say. Essentially, what we are is we are weekly interviews covering topics from cloud security, application security, basically things around cybersecurity, which we feel are relevant and are important from a current time perspective for anyone in the cloud space or in a hybrid cloud space. And we always get different guests to talk about different topics. Like last week, our topic was AppSec 101. And today, our topic, which you can see at the bottom, is how to create a highly effective cybersecurity team. Now, if you do want to watch any of the previous episodes, make sure you subscribe and to the YouTube channel or follow on Twitch or connect on LinkedIn. So or follow on LinkedIn if that's what your preference is. But enough about the show. Let's get into the episode. And I have Clint. Let me just get him on the show. Hey, Clint. Just checking if the audio is working.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it works. Thank you for coming. And
Nice.
just to give everyone else the context, Clint and I couldn't hear each other just before, so we had to. There you go. That's a little bit better. That looks a bit weird, doesn't it? I am gonna switch to this. Yeah, man. I think I'm glad you worked this out because I was just getting a bit. This is not working out. Cool. All right. Now we got the background and everything working. I just need to figure the other thing out. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. And by the way, for anyone who's joining us from LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitch, feel free to say hello. And we're just all a bunch of nice people over here. Hey, hi, Arun. There's hello coming in already. Hello, everyone. And I think I want to start with the obvious, which I do with every guest on the show. Is I've got my coffee, man. I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah, cheers.
Hey, cheers. You need to tell people what it is, though. I think they'll definitely find it interesting. What is? So I'm just drinking coffee. But what are you drinking?
Yeah, so I'm drinking Thai tea, actually. I was always a fan of it at restaurants. And I was like, oh, just if you buy the right sort of tea leaves, you can just make it yourself and add a little bit of condensed milk and you get this nice orange shade. So.
Oh, yeah. Wait, do you actually have condensed milk at your home as well? Or... Oh, yep. My friend, you are living the life.
Yeah, it's dangerous having that condensed milk around.
Yeah. I was gonna say it's definitely one of those ones where like I'm trying to control my sugar habits, but it's definitely one of the good ones, man. I would say that then. For the interview, for people who don't know, I've known of Clint and TLDR. Newsletter for some time. For people who haven't heard of TLDR or haven't heard of Clint, who is Clint? If you can introduce yourself in a few words.
Cool. Yeah. So what Ashish was just talking about is TLDRsec.com, which is a security newsletter I've started, which basically takes the best like blog posts, security conference talks and tools and tries to like put them together in one sort of condensed place. So you don't have to spend, tens of hours reading a week, just like, hey, here's the cool stuff that's happened recently. I write summaries of talks just so you can like read the detailed notes rather than watch hours and hours of talks, just trying to help push the security community forward better, faster. I started it because people were doing some really great work and not enough people had heard about them. And I was like, oh, there's all this awesome work that I want more people to hear about. So that's how it started. Before recently, I was a research director and technical director at NCC Group, so a global security consulting firm where I got to work with a bunch of smart people, as well as a bunch of really cool companies doing neat work. So a lot of what I say today is not necessarily my ideas, but what I've learned from people, way smarter than me, and I'm just trying to share the knowledge.
That's awesome, and I think I do want to call out the fact that what I have found that TLDR was really amazing for anyone who has not heard of it. Like before TLDR, I had to go scout the internet and find out what blogs and what articles are really relevant instead of spending hours trying to figure out, oh, this is not relevant. You know how, I mean, I'm sure you were doing this before me as well, where you just go on the internet and try and find like, oh, this is relevant. You just read the first half or read the title. Sounds interesting, but you go in and like, oh, I just wasted 5 minutes for no reason. So
Yeah.
It definitely helps me with that. So I do appreciate the work you do with TLDR, and I would definitely encourage others to kind of join in and support the newsletter as well, which is growing, by the way. From I think we were 2,000 people from last time I checked.
Yeah, I think it's a bit over 2,500 now. So
there you go, man. It's just crossing new boundaries as well. By the way, we're about to hit 200 on our YouTube subscribers, so I'm happy about that.
That's awesome.
The fact that we've done that in 3 months, I'm actually really appreciative of the fact that people have been really getting behind this. And people like Uday, Yazdi, and Arun, who are regulars as well, who have known for a while. So I really appreciate the fact that as well, man. So
if you want, you could include a link to it just to make it easy for people to find.
Or yeah, actually, I might just do that. I'll include that in the show note. I'll definitely want to promote that because I think it's definitely valuable. I do want to ask though, was this your path into cybersecurity? As in, were you always in cybersecurity, or did you transition from developer or something else into cybersecurity?
Yeah, so it kind of happened by accident, to be honest. I was
like all things in life.
Yeah, I was a first-year computer science major in college, and maybe a second year, but I sort of was like, taking classes, still trying to figure out what I was interested in. I went to college thinking I wanted to be a video game programmer because I loved video games, but then I learned that it turns out they work very long hours and it's very stressful. It's actually a pretty miserable industry by some accounts. And at the same time, I saw that there was my university had this graduate level computer security course that I was like, I just want to audit it and sit in, see what this is all about. And I sort of fell in love with it right from the beginning. And pretty much like midway through that class, I was like, I want to do like all my internships in security. I started reading security books, trying to find like good resources online, like OWASP and others. And pretty much since I happened to sit in on that one class, I've focused most of my efforts on learning more about security.
Interesting. And was that application security directly, or as in, what was it? Did you start with network security, or?
Yeah, I guess it was sort of like, it was a bit more academic, so sort of like high level security principles things.
Right.
But I think it was like a little bit of AppSec, a little bit of like operating system security, sort of like your typical like Linux type stuff.
Right.
And a little bit network security. So it sort of like touched on everything, but didn't go into anything in much detail. So I was like, okay, well, I need to learn all these different parts now.
So you actually that's a good way to get into, I guess, cybersecurity as well. You get an idea of, or I guess, majority of the fields that way. I'm going to start with a question that I'm sure a lot of people have in their mind, because we have a varied audience, people who are or students, who are, I guess, experienced folks as well. But everyone has a different definition for application security, and sometimes cloud security as well. And I'll let you pick whatever you want to tackle first. Like, what does cloud security mean for you? And then we can go into what does application security mean for you as well. Or you can go the other way around. But can you know what in your own way, what do you feel it means when people say cloud security or application security?
Yeah, that's a good question. I agree that I think both mean different things for different people. So I guess to me, application security would be focusing on the security of the software itself that makes up either a web application or something you run on your laptop or desktop or things like that. Sort of the software security itself, whereas like network security, you're looking at like, how can I sort of like scan networks and maybe like, are there vulnerable services listening and things like that? So like, yes, all of those individual services are like made of software, but I feel like there's just this more of like, how do I like move between machines? How do I, like, you don't necessarily care about like all the bugs in a given application. It's just like, can I get enough of a foothold to then do the next thing? And then And then AppSec and cloud security, I think, are a little bit blurry lines in terms of with the move to infrastructure as code using Terraform, CloudFormation, and so forth, where you're like codifying how does my cloud environment look in software. But yeah, I would say there are nuances to how you can do things both securely and insecurely in, say, GCP, AWS, and Azure, and so forth that isn't necessarily related to the software itself, but how it's configured. For example, OpenS3 buckets or leaking things like that. So I think that with infrastructure as code, the lines between AppSec and cloud security are blurring, but I would say AppSec is like, what is sort of the security of the software, and cloud security is like, oh, how does like all the different systems running in the cloud, like, are you like encrypting the database? Is the communication between them encrypted? I would say highly related, but I would say each unique disciplines that require a lot of knowledge to be competent.
And to your point with the advent of PaaS and SaaS and IaaS as well, like the lines are getting even more blurrier. So it definitely, and I think which is a great. It's definitely a challenge for a lot of teams to be like they have to manage IaaS, PaaS applications, right? So it's really good segue into I guess something that I'm sure a lot of other people think about this, and I think yesterday's comment, because we ran a poll for this about what makes a good metrics for an effective security team, right? The unanimous answer was, actually, it wasn't unanimous. It was like a mixed response. It was like an equal divide between yes and no. So it seemed like I ran the thing on Twitter, which is where actually we're live on Twitter as well, by the way. Hello to the Twitter followers. And I think I was going to say with what I found with both the polls that I ran on Twitter as well as on LinkedIn was there like a majority, yes, we have a security metrics. No, we don't have a security metrics. There was like a equal split between the two. And that made me realize that I wonder one of I guess our show supporters, Yasji, his comment that there's a team of stars versus a star team achieving results, right? I think that definition is so true for a lot of organizations. So I wanted to ask you, in terms of you, what's and I know it's a pretty loaded question. Like what do you look at when you think of a highly effective security team? Like what is going through your mind? Like what does that mean from a principal perspective, or what makes them effective, I guess?
Yeah. There's a lot to unpack there that I'd be happy to get into. But I guess one thing you said first was about metrics. So perhaps we can talk briefly about those.
Yeah. Let's go down.
Yeah, metrics are surprisingly hard, I think. The reason is a lot of things that sound like a good idea are either not, or like there's some subtleties there. So I guess, for example, you might want to say like, oh, we want to sort of decrease the number of like high-risk security vulnerabilities that we find. Like intuitively, you're like, oh, if that trends down over time, that sounds great, right? But what if, for example, you were not doing static analysis or dynamic analysis, and then you started doing that? So previously you had no visibility, and now you have some, and then all of a sudden you start finding a lot more issues, right? So you're like, oh no, our security, like by the metric we've defined, our security is actually worse. So it's important to not define metrics in a way that doing the right thing makes you look worse, like to upper management or things like that. So I think that's one thing that is sort of not obvious to some people, at least initially. It surprised me when I first had a friend mention it. I think an important or a useful metric is what is the like minimizing the time to fix. So it's like, yeah, maybe you're having a number of issues, and maybe some of them are severe, but like, is our agility, our ability to both once detected and reported, to like not just identify what part in maybe a very complicated ecosystem is affected, like, okay, which team owns this? Okay, how can we sort of give them the information or education they need to fix it, and then have them fix it, and then actually deploy that to production? So I guess minimizing the time from discovery to the fixes live in production, that is a useful time to shrink, which is actually very analogous to the various like DevOps handbooks and those sort of like, how do we maintain, or how do we build like a very highly effective software engineering environment, that's actually another metric that they, or like time between code being written and getting to production and making that very tight is actually, I would argue, like the same metric as this, just like a slightly different situation. So I think that's like an interesting parallel.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder how many people actually measure that though. I think like we're trying to, this is something that some of my colleagues and I are working on, is trying to find out the effectiveness of commits as well as to how often we're committing into production. Because a lot of people use that as a metric of how, well, not productive, but it's more to the point that how much code is being pushed in. And I look at that as like, oh, that's how much code we should have either gone through or we are about to go through, like things like that. That's how a security person would look at it. And to your point, it's a parallel to how many lines of code am I committing to production. So yeah, definitely I can see the parallels. But to your point, if it's how quickly am I resolving, or is there, I think there's another side to this where people talk about how quickly you're finding out as well, which is another metric, I imagine. Yeah, and I think that's kind of where it's a good segue into, because the question that came in from Arun over here, which is, which tool do you recommend for SaaS testing that allows integration with CI/CD pipeline? Any good open source available? Before you answer that, if you can touch upon SaaS test and if what it is, and if you have what does it look like in an effective team? If you could probably answer that and then jump into it, if you don't mind, because we have an audience which is kind of like would not even know what SaaS test is.
Yeah, sure. That sounds great. So SAST and DAST are sort of the two big buckets for like how do you analyze or test source code automatically. So static is basically looking at code without running it. And then DAST or dynamic analysis is basically running code and then poking at it to see how it behaves. So there's some inherent trade-offs in both. So we could talk for like an hour about the details, but sort of at a high level, static analysis is nice in that you get coverage, right? So you can see all of the code, but you have to make, in general, when you're analyzing things, some assumptions about how the code fits together. Like you're trying to reason about, okay, we see at this one route, a user supplied input in like a URL parameter, gets passed to this function, gets passed to this function, and then eventually gets sent to the database, but it's not escaped, so maybe there's SQL injection. So oftentimes when you're reasoning about, millions of lines of code, there's sort of assumptions that the tools need to make for like theoretical computer science reasons, not just like the tool is bad. So there's like false positives there. So the tool might say things are an issue that aren't. Whereas for dynamic analysis, the strength is that there's sometimes false positives, but more often if it detects an issue, it's a real issue because you've like actually observed it happening. And there's also some imprecisions there, but sort of the fundamental weakness of dynamic analysis is you can only test the security of things that you can, functionality that you can exercise. So for example, think of like Microsoft Word or Excel, like the web app version of those, or I guess we can just say like Facebook for like an actual example. Like you can imagine that there's edge cases like, okay, you have to post a comment and then mention a friend, but that friend has to be on your block list. And like if you think of sort of the complexity of real applications in terms of like what state needs to be true for you to exercise every condition, it's very complex. And if a dynamic analysis tool doesn't test those, then it can't find vulnerabilities in it. So if there's like a vulnerability in something that's like 10 menu things deep, like you might not find it. Whereas, or maybe there's like an endpoint that is never called. It's like a backup admin API that's like in the source code, but is not ever called in the front end. Like a DAST tool would never see that. But static analysis could see that because it's seeing everything. So it's like, do you want limited coverage or potentially false positives? Or so there's more, but that's sort of like hand wavily an overview.
Awesome. And and now if we move into the tools section for answering Arun's question around what do you recommend as tools, or what tools you allow integration, and any good open source tools that are available?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say some, regardless of what tool, some principles that are useful to keep in mind is like, is there a way to run this tool on the command line, or does it have like a REST API? Does it dump results in JSON or some format that is easy to extract? Does it run easily in, say, a GitHub action or a GitLab runner or Circle CI? Like all of the existing, so for your company, look at like, okay, what do developers use? Or do we already have an AppSec pipeline that we use for other tools? Like, can this tool fit easily into that? You could think like, oh, we could scan every commit or every pull request or every time someone's merging to master. So there's like different points that you could choose. I would encourage you probably to analyze more at the pull request or merge request level rather than each commit, because sometimes there's like work in progress commits that might not be important. But yeah, so I guess like think about what your current CI/CD pipeline looks like and think like, oh, are there other tools that fit in there well? But yeah, Uday just pointed out, yeah, so for Dast, Zap is a good tool. It's by OWASP, it's open source. Yeah, I think there's a couple of other Dast tools that are open source, but I feel like they're sort of special purpose, and I don't know if they have great coverage. I think there's like Arachne, maybe a couple of others. I think the free version of Burp Suite, which is not open source, but does have an API you may be able to integrate into CI as well. But I would definitely look for Zap. For static analysis, there's a number of tools per language, right? So for like Roslyn and I think PumaScan for .NET. There's like Brakeman for Rails, ESLint with some various security plugins for JavaScript, Bandit, DLint, and others for Python. So actually, my company that I just joined is building an open source static analysis tool called SemGrep, which basically is like, rather than having many tools for many languages, can we create sort of one easy to use tool that handles like a bunch of languages? That's ideally also fast and easy to use. So it's open source on GitHub. We can like post a link to it.
Yeah, sounds good. I think I was going to add to this point and the more you mention about Dast, I think a lot of people kind of forget this, like the difference between an open source and a paid version. And this is what my observation has been. You can correct me if I'm wrong, where a paid Dast tool would have something like an automatic scanning as well. So if you're not a pen tester, but you just want to find like, can this thing do a robot scan and tell me what I need to look for? It can do that, but then you can go down the path of investigating that further. But a lot of the open source tool may not have that option. I'm not sure if your tool already does, so I'll probably let you talk about that. But is that true that people do need to consider that fact that if you go for open source, then you might actually have to go, what do you call it? People have to go down the path of actually understanding how this works. Like they probably need to have someone with the pen testing knowledge or some knowledge of how to use a tool and what to look for. Is that a real scenario?
For SAST or Dast or both?
For Dast, sorry.
Yeah. So I just sent you in the private chat a link to the tool. I don't see how I can comment on comments.
That's all right. I can add that in. That's perfect.
Yeah. I think ideally, or most Dast tools, including Zap, you can sort of point it at something and it will try to auto crawl, and then the things that it observes, it will then start testing. I think oftentimes there's at least some initial setup in terms of like, we need to make sure that it can log in to my application. Like it is like, does it use OAuth or does it use just like standard username and password? Sometimes like very front-end heavy applications are difficult for Dast tools because they are like dynamically creating page content, which like if they're looking for URLs in the raw HTML, but it's like, oh, React is like dynamically generating that. So it's sort of like hard to crawl. But yeah, so one trick that I've seen a couple of companies do that I think is pretty neat is like, rather than having to sort of hand code a bunch of knowledge into the Dast tool to make sure that it can get good coverage, you basically take your existing integration unit tests for the developers have built, and then you basically proxy those through Zap or whatever Dast tool you're using. And then that way you are teaching it all the endpoints and what arguments are there. And then you can run Zap's fuzzing mode on the data that your integration test that you already have built provides. So you don't have to create like separate security integration tests. I mean, ideally you do that as well so that you can get a little bit better coverage, but that's a way to get some initial quick coverage like for free in that you already have them.
All right. And I think Arun just mentioned they're using Snyk at the moment for, I think that's more than SAS. I think Snyk, I thought was more of a software composition analysis.
Yeah, Yeah. So if you think about like what are sort of dangerous things in your software, you have like the stuff in your software itself that's first party that your company has written. So that's typically what static analysis or SAST tools focus on. But you also use a lot of third-party dependencies, which Ashish just mentioned, software composition analysis or SCA. Those things look for vulnerabilities in the software you're using. So the third party. So Snyk is one example. It's quite popular. GitHub has Dependabot as well. And I think there's OWASP dependency check also that has a number of support for different languages.
That's right. I think that begs the question. That begs the question for me. I think the tools are important, but coming back to the topic about the security team that we're talking about, and I think security team typically, I mean, AppSec is just one part of it. There's SOC teams, there's security awareness. There's so many, depending on what organization you're in. Yeah. You can have like a lot of different teams and like 30, 40 people talking about different things, right? How have you seen, I guess, and this is a question that was posed by ESG, around tips on how to bring cohesion in a security team to make it more effective? Like, I think, have you got some experience around that?
Yeah, I think, a couple of things. First, maybe I'll talk about like cohesion, to your point, like between security teams, and then maybe between security teams and development, which I think is perhaps even more important, or at least equally important. Yeah, so I think between security teams, one thing that's important to sort of realize and acknowledge is that obviously everyone's on the same page or on the same team. So for example, like you don't want your SOC team to get overburdened and overwhelmed with responding to incidents all the time. So having like a feedback loop between, hey, here's the types of malicious behavior we are observing, here's the types of issues we've had compromise us in the past. And working with the AppSec and cloud security team to say, oh, like we keep seeing, I don't know, cross-site scripting or SQL injection or XXE or whatever. Like, okay, let's like push that to the AppSec team to then partner with security champions or maybe build some secure wrapper libraries or things to try to basically save the SOC team work. And similarly with the cloud security team. So I think there's a lot of value from sort of like cross-pollinating and sharing information between the teams, which also builds empathy. But one, I think, so with regards to development teams and security, I think there's been a very interesting shift in how security teams can and should work, similar to how there was a shift from like waterfall to agile and then from on-prem to cloud. I think similarly, there's a shift in security teams where, we used to be sort of the graybeards who'd like slam down their staff and say, you can't pass, like you can't do this thing, developers.
I grew the beard just for that, secure. So I can put it down with like be Gandalf, but
yeah, because without the beard, people don't take it seriously. You got to have the beard.
Yeah, that's right.
No, but fair enough. I think one thing that I observed, so I'm based out of the San Francisco Bay Area, so there's lots of very tech-forward companies, lots of startups, and one thing that is sort of a consistent trend is that in many companies, the security team either can't say no to developers or it's like very limited. Like you can, but you get like 2 no's a year, like max. And it has to be like very serious. So I think the question becomes like, how do we enable development teams to move both quickly and securely? Because fundamentally, if something is perfectly secure but features are too slow, or you don't have product market fit or whatever, like the company goes out of business. So security fundamentally, I think, needs to view itself as an enabler of the business, not as a something slowing it down. So I think having a security champions program, building tight relationships with engineering. One thing I've seen is that we chatted about a little bit before this is I think rather than focusing on identifying vulnerabilities, instead trying for the security team to be sort of less breakers and more builders in terms of, can we build security services and libraries and things that are secure by default that developers can then use, which then enables them to do their work quickly, but also securely because they don't need to worry about security because it's just like transparently handled by them, by the library or by the service.
Right. And to your point, I think it's a great example because application security team, and I think if we just focus on application security team, for them to be effective in a world where of startups, and especially in San Francisco, where there's like a lot of new companies coming in, do you see them looking at application security? Because to your point, if you can't sell, like for lack of a better word, security doesn't mean jack shit, right?
Totally.
So how do you see them approaching this with their teams when they're, and I think I'll call this out because I know a couple of our listeners are startup founders as well, who themselves are keen on security, but how do you see the tech companies approach this in the beginning? I mean, if you have some seen in the beginning, how people approach in the start, like do they lay the foundations for it in the beginning so that they can come back to it? Or that's like I'm going to put this in the back burner and come back to this when I make some money?
Yeah, I mean, if you make the right technology and language choices early, you can head off a lot of like classes of issues that you just don't have to worry about as much later. For example, using like a memory managed or a memory safe language, like you just don't have to worry about whole classes of like memory safety issues, which is nice. Like if you're not using C and C++, but any other modern language. But yeah, to your point, if you're a startup that doesn't yet have a product that people are paying you for, or you're like burning lots of cash and not profitable yet, to be honest, I think it doesn't really make sense for you to spend a huge amount of time in security, which is strange. Like as a security person,
Yeah.
obviously, this is like very important to me. But like if you don't really have any customer data, or the data you have is like pretty, like it doesn't really matter. Like obviously, if you have like social security numbers or like healthcare data, or if you're in like a regulated industry, like yes, it very much matters that you have a good security posture. But if you're like, I don't know, some like photo sharing site that like all the photos are public or something, it's like, yeah, maybe you should have some security, but like the worst case scenario is not that bad. So what I see is generally, unless you're a security focused company or you are in like a regulated industry, you probably don't have anyone doing security full time. Maybe it's a CTO that does it part time until you're probably, I don't know, like 50 people, maybe 100 people. And I see companies starting to take security seriously when it's maybe like 200 to 500 people. Once you start really gaining traction and you have sort of this rapid scaling, is when you start like hiring a couple of SOC engineers and AppSec engineers and things like that.
And I think at that point, it's probably a good time because to your point about 200, 500 people, then that also means you have a lot of developers as well. And you're pumping out a lot of code into production and into the master branch. And I feel like you kind of touched upon the security champion program as well, to bring it back home with an effect. If it was a highly effective application security team, which is measuring the number of bugs not being released or picked up early in the CI/CD pipeline, how do you look at that as going? How do you look at that as being something which is adding value to the organization, if you know what I mean? As in, how do you show value to the organization that yes, that this is my metrics of being highly effective as a team, not just as like as a subset. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think like you said, like number of issues prevented before they reach production. I think if you have like pen tests or bug bounty or things like that showing that the sort of number or severity of issues is trending down over time, is definitely one evidence of being an effective team. Another is, which I think is a very highly leveraged thing to do, is if you can show, like, we used to have this class of vulnerabilities, but we've like totally squashed it. We used to have secrets in code, but then we rolled out Vault or secrets management from your cloud provider, and like we just don't have this class of issues anymore. Yeah.
I think I love the fact that you mentioned about the class of index as well, right? Oh yeah, thanks today. I know no more master branches. Sorry, I did not realize this. I don't know, with the hashtag Black Lives Matter, that the master slave branch. I did not have that context before, but thanks for pointing that out, Uday. That the right word to use is not master anymore. It's the production branch. I'm just going to call it production branch. I was gonna ask in terms of another challenge that I see with teams trying to effectively work with other, I guess, other teams. And I think they kind of have asked this over here. Creating metrics quantitatively gives results but hurtful. Would you say it's better to avoid it altogether? It's kind of like trying to ask what I was asking earlier, but I'll add my question later once you answer that. What do you think around that comment?
Metrics that can hurt people's feelings?
Yes, most likely.
Yeah. Yeah, I do know one large software company, sort of like FANG-sized, if you're familiar with that term, like Facebook, Apple, Netflix, Google, blah blah blah. Like one massive company did some Git history mining to determine, like, for the vulnerabilities we're discovering who committed them, and sort of did some historical analysis. And I think they found that certain people were much more likely than others to do that. And
Really?
I think they ended up like not pushing forward with that program because it felt like too sort of name and shamey, and it caused some like political tensions, I think. So yeah, so it is something like you have to sort of be careful about. I do know that people can be competitive in a positive way. So something a couple of companies have done is having a dashboard that has a sort of like green, yellow, red, orange color per, say, functional group or microservice or application. That's like, what is the security posture of it? Like, does it have a lot of known vulnerabilities? Does it have access to a lot of sensitive data? Is it internet facing? Like, does it have dependencies that are very much out of date with known vulnerabilities? So basically, like, by having like a executive level, like, pretty dashboard where you don't need to know anything about security, and then linking that to like all the VPs or directors and being like, oh, like, nobody wants to be in charge of the team where like all their stuff is orange or red. So I think that can be some like healthy peer pressure. And I guess if it's at the sort of like org or team level and not necessarily the individual person level, I think that that's maybe a little bit less or less likely to hurt people's feelings, hopefully. But if done in the right way, I think you can inspire people through, people are naturally competitive. So if you can be like, oh, like, we want to be, the best team, we want our SLA to be the fastest. When done, I think in a socially adept way, it can be a good thing. But I think it's definitely useful to also reflect, like, let's not hurt anyone's feelings because, we're all on the same team.
Yeah, and I think to your point, the way I see the whole highly effective security team is, I think, how silos have always existed with security and in the waterfall method. I always feel a highly effective team in security is also a team that's working really well with the rest of the organization as well. There's always a healthy tension, totally given that. But I personally feel, no matter how you look at it, because cybersecurity is IT, right? Cybersecurity without IT is there's no cybersecurity. Like, let's just be honest. Without them, we don't exist. So there is no way we could have had any existence without them. So our success is driven by their success as well. That's how I have always approached this. And to your point about, I guess, getting a feel of the organization is also important, because we're all humans at the end of the day, right? So yes, it's great for me to just come up with a report and like, this is the scan that I ran. This is what the vulnerabilities are. Go and fix it. Blah blah blah. This is why you should be better. Blah. I mean, you could just totally go hunter mode if you want to, but the reality of it is you're not the one fixing it. They have to fix it, and they can choose to go bugger off and like, don't come back to me because I hate you, and that's it. So you could just be stuck in an organization. You might have a highly effective team, like all superstars who have massive pen testing experience, massive application security experience, but if the rest of the organization doesn't want to talk to you, like, I don't know how successful you would really be at that point. No metrics would count anything, right? So I personally feel I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, totally. I think that's a really great point, and one that I think Tanya was making last one of your podcasts, which is like, fundamentally, being in security is not just a purely technical role. It's about like building relationships, and ultimately being able to influence other teams that you don't necessarily have direct authority over, right? So
Yep.
like, can you sort of influence and lead without sort of just being like, do it because I said so, right? Yeah, I think ultimately, like, you could find, let's say hypothetically, in some like magical world, you could find every single vulnerability that exists. Like, obviously this is impossible, but like, let's say even if you could, if you can't convince anyone to fix it and you don't have the time or bandwidth to fix it yourself, the security team that is, like, it kind of doesn't matter, right? Like
Yeah.
ultimately it's about having things fixed and reducing risk over time, not finding all the bugs, because like ultimately that's only part of the solution. So
yeah. I think to your point about, sorry, go on.
Oh yeah, I just think like a sort of a core part of any effective security team is having strong relationships with leadership and engineering teams, like all the engineering teams, because there's probably many, and like compliance and legal, and yeah, I think having strong relationships with every team as much as possible. Like sometimes maybe some people just don't like you, you rub them the wrong way, but as much as possible, I think that should be like a core indicator of success as well. Because ultimately, we're like people influencing other teams, not just doing our own thing.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I think it's definitely a measurement that people should have. I personally have as well. I think I even go to the point of doing sales and marketing as well, because to your point about tech startups, where it's like a lot of the conversations are driven by sales. Like if there is no sales, there is no more product. So you kind of have to work with the sales team and the marketing. Yeah, 100%, man. I think what you're on the money right there. I did want to cover another topic, which is coming back to the SaaS and DaaS conversation.
Just quickly about sales and marketing. Like, I think that security can enable both of those teams, right? So if you're selling to enterprise, probably you need to be able to have a strong security story. Like, this is how we take it seriously. Here's all the impressive things we've done to keep your data secure. And then marketing, you could write, say, posts on the engineering blog, like, here's some cool things we're doing to keep your data safe. So I think security can enable many teams. But yeah, sorry, keep going.
Yeah. I think that's a good one. And I think to your point about effectiveness comes from how you're giving value back to the teams as well, and not just to the customers of the product, but also to the other teams as well. So I guess if I were to kind of put it as a metric, so I think the first thing we spoke about, I guess, was having a metrics of the number of bugs being resolved before we go into production, or detected and resolved. The other one being having, I guess, a camaraderie between the teams themselves. Like if we have an AppSec team, SOC team, and I think all of us would help us each other effectively. And the next one being working effectively with the other teams as well, like sales, marketing, customers, and all that. And especially developing a bond with the developers in the tech space within the organization to have bugs resolved, because without them, we don't exist. And it's kind of like a give and take relationship at that point. I often find having conversations around application security, or even SOC for that matter, there's always like a conversation around signal to noise ratio as well.
Totally.
From an AppSec context, SAST is like notorious for having a high noise rate. Like, there's like just so much noise in there. Is there a, like, I think that we wanted to cover a couple of aspects before we kind of answer that question. One, AppSec programs, what are they? And two, how do you have that? What's an effective AppSec program according to you? If you have let's start with those two, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Sorry, you mentioned like noisy tools. Did you want to chat about that?
Yeah,
first,
sorry, I was going to get into like AppSec program, then get into what you implement in an AppSec program, and then into, sorry, I just like went like completely on there. But
sure, yeah.
So I wanted to kind of have like, that was me trying to bridge my thoughts together. So like, let's talk about the AppSec program tools, and then we get into how do we reduce the noise ratio.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, so an AppSec program usually. Sometimes companies call these ProdSec, or product security teams. So it seems like different companies I see use those terms semi-interchangeably, but basically you are responsible for supporting the engineering or development teams in developing high-quality secure software. So you, depending on how big the company is and the security teams, there may be like a separate like corporate security team who's responsible for like internal only things. Maybe there's like a physical security team in terms of like managing the building and things, and maybe a cloud security team responsible for like how things are actually deployed in production, and maybe so there's like a variety of security teams, and it depends on the company. These are sort of fluid, but to me, the AppSec or product security team is responsible for the sort of primary software, both external as well as internal the company's developing.
Cool. And it's funny, as we're talking about this, there's a float of messages from Yossi about experiences for the check marks and other people as well. They've asked you an interesting question, which I wanted to cover as part of this. What was your best or worst team experience, if you can share?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I mean, I have like some good and some bad ones. I don't know if like a clearly best or worst one comes to mind. I guess one really good one that I remember is that I think also speaks to having relationships between members of other teams. So I was a security engineer at sort of like a small startup, and I was very good friends with the DevOps team, just because we got along and we were like super good friends, and we like sat not too far away from each other. And there was like some new service I needed to release, and so I was like, hey, just a heads up, I built this thing, like no hurry, take your time, but like when you want to, feel free to like deploy it. Here's where the Git repo is. And then like 10 minutes later, they were like, it's live. And I was like, oh, I didn't expect you to do that. And they're like, no, man, like I got you. And I don't think they like purposefully delayed other things, but like I noticed that whenever I was having trouble with something or was releasing something new, they were like super on top of it. And it was because we just had like a very strong like friendship and trust. And like whenever they needed anything, I was like, oh yeah, I'll help you like anytime. Just let me know. So I think that really like drove home to me the power of having strong working relationships with people, because ultimately like companies are made of people. So when people want to help each other, like things are just going to go way smoother. Even if like technically this team is supporting this team, I think personal relationships matter a lot more than sort of we let on, or at least that we like to sort of officially acknowledge.
Yep. And
probably worst experience. Yeah, there's a number of like consulting projects I was on where it would be like horrendously underscoped. Where it would be like, okay, cool, you have like 5 or 10 days to test this thing that's like 4 million lines of code, and like you don't get a buildable environment, and like the test environment is like half broken. So yeah, just feeling like I really wanted to do a good job, but having a lot of sort of barriers in the way to being able to deliver work of the quality that I wanted to. The project ended up being fine, but quite stressful in the middle of it.
Oh, yeah, I can. Yeah, I'm not going to comment on my personal experience. Maybe it's for a couple of beers later. But
yeah, later.
I think another suggestion came from Yossi around effective teams. He mentioned that fortnightly or monthly brown paper sessions between SOC and IT teams has helped. I guess so. That has been his experience. And Uday has mentioned, do not say anything about check marks, please. My employer won't be happy. Do we want to talk about check marks? I guess like what a great tool it is, but maybe no. We're kind of towards the end, and if anyone has any questions, just definitely keep pouring them in. Towards the end of this interview, I usually go for some fun questions. It's not that many; it's just 2 or 3 fun questions around non-technology related. So totally. Yeah, sure. I didn't want you to be prepared for it, so I've been giving you a heads up on it. But the first question is, what do you spend most time on when you're not working on AppSec or technology?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I haven't as much recently due to current COVID times.
Oh yeah, there is that as well. Yep.
But I'm a big fan of improv comedy. So if you're familiar with Whose Line Is It Anyway, just sort of like making up scenes and characters on the spot.
Yep.
I was on a team and we had shows periodically, which was super fun. And I also like musicals, so attending those is fun.
Oh, I think you and I need to talk about improv comedy after this. But I'm just gonna because
Yeah.
I'll start because I did my first class in the beginning of this year or late last year, and I was supposed to go back to proper classes. But anyway, yeah, it's for another night. The second question that I have is, what is something that you're proud of but is not on your social media?
That's a good question.
Like a lot of people talk about their family and then the things that they've achieved, but yeah, curious to know, what do you feel?
There's there were a few people who had non-traditional computer science backgrounds. They just came from various fields, who sort of over time expressed a lot of interest in security, and we sort of like I partnered with them and mentored them a bit, and a number of them have then joined in various security roles. And over the past few years, they've gone from being very new to security to being quite awesome, and now they've like moved on to their second and third in some cases roles in security, and they're just like sort of blossoming into these amazing security professionals. So I'm very proud of that, because I saw them go from sort of like passion and interest to being sort of like respected people in the security industry. So that I think is very cool.
No, that's awesome, man. I think to be able to help someone in their journey is an amazing feeling. I mean, I guess mentoring someone is just I can totally respect that, man. Last question: what is your favorite cuisine or restaurant that you can share? Going by your chi, I can make a guess, but I'll let you answer.
Yeah, I do like Thai food. I'm also a big fan of Indian food as well, like naan and various types of curries.
Nice.
There's a place not too far from me that has like hand cut Chinese noodles, like sort of rolled from scratch every day, and that's quite excellent.
Really? Wow, man! You just like hand cut. I mean, do they have hand cut prices as well? Like in terms of like,
it's actually not too bad. Yeah.
Oh, really? Okay, good. Usually, I would imagine. I mean, I guess it's different in COVID times, but I imagine people just going, if it's handmade, there's like extra $2 right there for every noodle that you eat, like whatever. But kind of works out. But I did want to say, it's been awesome. Where can people find you on social media to reach out to you for further questions?
Yeah, I'm at Clint Gibler on Twitter. If you search on LinkedIn for my name, I'd be happy to connect with you and chat. If you want to, so we talked about this earlier, but if you want to see the sort of free weekly newsletter I write, you can go to tldrsec.com. So TLDR, so too long didn't read, sec for security. But yeah, happy to chat on any of these platforms.
I would definitely leave the link for that in the show notes. But thank you so much for taking the time out, Clint. Really appreciate that, man.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And thank you to everyone for joining and asking awesome questions.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And we would see you guys next week. Thank you so much.
Okay.
And